we could see him sitting there as the counts were read out. There's 34 counts. So foreman of the jury stood up and said guilty to count one, and then said guilty another 33 times. And then the jury were polled to check that the verdict was unanimous, and we could sort of see him turning to look at them as they did that. And then when they were let out, he sort of stood there at the defense table, and you could see him sort of sigh. He kind of breathed in quite heavily and sighed.
Let's take you straight to our top story this morning. After a 6-week trial, it only took a New York jury 2 days to reach a unanimous verdict, finding Donald Trump guilty of all 34 charges of falsifying business records to conceal a payment made to the porn actor Stormy Daniels during his 2016 campaign for the White House. The verdict, in the midst of this presidential campaign, makes him the first former president in American history to be convicted in a criminal court. Will Pavia is the Times correspondent in New York.
Donald Trump, the former president of the United States and one of the, an expected favorite for the presidency this year, has just been convicted by a court in New York, in Lower Manhattan, of 34 counts of falsifying business records to conceal a so-called hush money payment to a porn star.
Gosh, even just hearing the summary, Will, is quite staggering. This is history-making in that he is the first former president to be convicted in a criminal court. Of course, the context of this is the middle of a presidential election campaign. And so let's turn immediately to reaction. First of all, I suppose from Donald Trump, what's he had to say about the conviction?
Well, he said it was a disgrace. We could see him sitting there as the counts were read out. There's 34 counts. So foreman of the jury stood up and said guilty to count one, and then said guilty another 33 times. And then the jury were polled to check that the verdict was unanimous, and we could sort of see him turning to look at them as they did that. And then when they were let out, he sort of stood there at the defense table, and you could see him sort of sigh. He kind of breathed in quite heavily and sighed. And he walked out into the corridor. The corridor has been where he's sort of given a lot of his almost sort of pseudo campaign speeches. He normally goes into the corridor and attacks the case and says he should be on the campaign trail. And then he'll attack Joe Biden, and he'll talk about whatever he's interested in that day in a sort of broader context. But in this case, he walked out and he said that the case was a disgrace, and that the judge was corrupt, and the charges were rigged. And then he said that the real verdict would be in November when voters go to the polls.
What are the implications? What is the suggested impact of this for that day, for polling day, for the presidential election?
It's really tricky to tell. There were opinion polls just before this trial began, which suggested that this was the case that voters thought was the least serious of the 4 criminal cases that Donald Trump was facing. But there was a significant number of those who sort of weren't quite sure where they stood on this, who felt that a guilty verdict, a conviction, would make them change their mind and they'd be less inclined to vote for someone with a conviction. So there's been the suggestion that this would change some people's minds. But lots of political strategists are a little bit skeptical because Donald Trump has so successfully used things that you would think would kill off the careers of so many other politicians to his advantage. And even this trial, he's been able to sort of use it as a sort of another stage for his campaign and to garner lots of attention, so much so that towards the end of the trial, when closing statements were happening, the Biden campaign actually did a press conference across the road, and they sort of said, we're not here to talk about the trial, we're just here because all the media is here. So lots of people wonder if convicted felon will actually be a bad thing for President Trump, although you would sort of assume that it won't be a helpful thing.
What are the implications, I suppose, by way of process? What happens next? He is yet to be sentenced, for example.
Yes, so the judge has set a sentencing date of July the 11th. And before that, Donald Trump has to go before a probation office in the courtroom, where you normally go for a pre-sentencing report, where the sort of probation officers ask you about your history and your character, and Really, it's a chance for a lot of defendants to sort of argue for a lighter sentence by talking about extenuating circumstances in their own background. I mean, in this case, it's a rather unusual interview because Donald Trump committed the crimes that he's been convicted of while he was in the White House. I mean, he signed 9 of the checks that are at the heart of the case in the Oval Office. So it'll be a rather strange interview, you would think. Then he'll go for sentencing. He will almost certainly immediately appeal, and the sentencing is usually deferred in a case like this until after that appeal. So that appeal could take about a year. And so what's slightly less clear, the possible sentence for this is up to 4 years, but custodial sentences are sort of fairly unusual for cases involving the falsification of business records. And so the judge might give him a deferred sentence or a conditional discharge or some sort of probation. There's a question over whether he'd be allowed to vote in Florida. If you're still serving a sentence in Florida, you're not allowed to vote. But perhaps that would be deferred until after the election. If he wins the election, and if the judge were to sentence him to jail time, he would almost certainly be shielded from that by the fact that he was president of the United States. There's a sort of standing memo in the Justice Department that presidents should not be incarcerated because it makes it very hard for them to fulfill the duties of their office. So there are lots of things that are still slightly unclear because we're in such uncharted waters, but that's sort of what's happening next. Is we've got the sentencing, and then I think it's not that long before the Republican convention where he's expected to be nominated as president, as the presidential candidate.
Gosh, I mean, while appreciating this is the definition of unprecedented, and there are lots of things still to happen, Will, you have been covering this, over the last couple of months. Have you ever known anything like it? As you reflect today and appreciating it has only just happened, but as you consider all that has happened, how are you reflecting on this?
Well, it has been a very strange event. I've covered lots of big trials in New York before, and I've also actually covered trials involving Donald Trump. I covered the trial, the civil fraud trial that was brought against him. That was a civil case where there was no chance of jail, and where he didn't necessarily have to attend. So the extraordinary thing here was to see someone like Donald Trump, who is not known as a big sort of rule follower, was suddenly in a criminal courtroom where the stakes are higher and where he has to be there every day, and where the judge was quite a strict judge about decorum and order. And so we saw him sitting there day in, day out for since April the 15th, going through some quite sort of boring, tedious processes of jury selection and legal arguments. Quite often he'd be sitting there with his eyes closed. It looked as if he was asleep. And if you've been following Donald Trump for a while, you whatever you think of him and however you see him, you don't normally think of him as someone who's asleep. It's almost like as we'd never seen him before. So that was very strange. And also just the sort of whole apparatus of a campaign suddenly being in a courtroom was also bizarre. Then you had the witnesses who some of them were huge characters. You had people who seemed still to be loyal to President Trump, who'd been required to testify by a subpoena. You had Hope Hicks, who's his former communications director. She gave like a particularly damning piece of evidence where she said that Trump had told her in 2018, when the story of the hush money payment came out, that he thought that it was better that the story that they were dealing with it now rather than before the election, which sort of made the prosecutor's argument. And after she said it, they said no further questions. And she then burst into tears. She still was very attached to him and still sort of wanted his respect in a sense. And there were other witnesses too who were still very loyal to him and spoke about him very warmly. You had all these Trump Organization people as well talking, and then you had someone like Michael Cohen, his former fixer, who is sort of now this sort of political nemesis, this person who talks frequently on his podcasts about wanting to have him jailed, who's a very, very problematic witness. And of course, you also had Stormy Daniels, the lady who says that she had a one-night stand with him in 2006, who talked and seemed incredibly comfortable on the stand and talked at great length and in great detail about this story, which according to the logic of the hush money payment, was supposed to be covered up. That was something that she recounted to all the jurors who were sort of listening with rapt attention. So throughout the trial, there were these bizarre, very striking kind of moments, even though at its root, it was technically quite a boring case about the falsification of business records.
That is Will Pavia reporting from New York, as he has been for the Times throughout the course of Donald Trump's hush money trial.